You have noticed specific pattern where avoidants seem magnetically drawn to super empaths, drawn to people who possess profound emotional intelligence, who demonstrate exceptional capacity for understanding others' inner worlds, who offer seemingly unlimited compassion and patience, who can hold space for complex feelings without becoming overwhelmed or withdrawing. This attraction appears paradoxical because avoidants organize their entire defensive structure around avoiding emotional intimacy, around suppressing vulnerable feelings, around maintaining defended distance from others' emotional needs. Yet despite these defended patterns, despite their conscious preference for emotional simplicity and independence, despite their stated desire for partners who are less emotionally intense or demanding, avoidants consistently find themselves drawn to super empaths in ways they cannot fully control or understand. The attraction operates beyond conscious choice. Avoidants who swear they want unemotional, independent partners repeatedly pursue relationships with deeply feeling empathic people. Avoidants who end relationships with empaths, citing too much emotional intensity, find themselves unable to stay away. Despite their stated reasons for leaving, avoidants who attempt relationships with less emotionally attuned partners find those relationships unsatisfying in ways that drive them back toward empathic connections. This magnetic pull between avoidants and super empaths reflects fundamental psychological principle called law of polarity. Principle stating that opposites attract because each pole contains what the other pole lacks, because extreme positions create magnetic field drawing poles toward each other in attempt to achieve balance and wholeness. The avoidant represents one pole characterized by emotional suppression, defended independence, minimized vulnerability, controlled expression of feeling. The super empath represents opposite pole characterized by emotional accessibility, relational interdependence, embraced vulnerability, fluid expression of feeling. These opposite poles create magnetic attraction because each unconsciously recognizes in the other what they have disowned or suppressed in themselves. The avoidant is drawn to empath's emotional capacity they have defended against accessing. The empath is drawn to avoidant's emotional control they struggle to maintain in themselves. The attraction for avoidance specifically stems from super empath providing external access to emotional world. The avoidant's defenses prevent them from accessing internally. The avoidant has suppressed their own emotional experience, has disconnected from their vulnerable feelings, has defended against awareness of their own needs for connection and intimacy. This suppression creates internal void where emotional experience should exist. Void the avoidant consciously experiences as comfortable independence, yet unconsciously experiences as profound loneliness and disconnection from authentic self. The super empath fills this void by providing external emotional experience the avoidant can access vicariously without having to lower their own defenses. Through relationship with empath, avoidant gains access to feeling world, to emotional understanding, to vulnerable human experience. Their defenses prevent them experiencing directly through their own internal awareness. Yet the magnetic pull that draws avoidant to super empath creates fundamentally unsustainable dynamic, unless avoidant engages genuine therapeutic work to address their defended structure. The attraction is real and powerful. Avoidant genuinely cannot stay away from super empath because empath provides what avoidant desperately needs, even while defenses prevent avoidant from acknowledging that need. Yet attraction alone does not create capacity for healthy relationship. The same defenses that create avoidant's need for empath's emotional accessibility simultaneously prevent avoidant from sustaining intimate relationship that accessing empath's emotional world would require. The avoidant wants what empath provides, yet cannot tolerate the intimacy required to receive what they want, creates push-pull dynamic where they are drawn toward empath, yet must withdraw when intimacy exceeds their defended tolerance, results in repetitive cycle of pursuit and withdrawal that harms empath while failing to provide avoidant with sustainable access to emotional world they are drawn to empath to experience. The super empath provides what the avoidant's defenses prevent them from accessing internally. The avoidant has constructed defensive structure throughout their development that requires suppression of emotional experience, disconnection from vulnerable feelings, minimization of needs for connection and intimacy. This defensive structure typically developed as adaptive response to childhood environment where emotional expression was punished or ignored, where vulnerability led to rejection or abandonment, where needs for comfort or connection were met with dismissal or inconsistency. The child who becomes avoidant learned that emotional expression creates danger rather than connection, that vulnerability generates rejection rather than support, that needing others leads to disappointment rather than fulfillment. These painful lessons taught the developing child to suppress emotions rather than express them, to disconnect from vulnerability rather than risk sharing it, to deny needs rather than risk having needs unmet or punished. The adult avoidant maintains this defensive suppression even though childhood circumstances no longer exist. Even though adult relationships could potentially provide safety, childhood relationships lacked. The defenses have become automatic unconscious structure rather than conscious choice. The avoidant does not actively decide to suppress emotions. Suppression happens automatically before emotions reach conscious awareness. The avoidant does not choose to disconnect from vulnerability. Disconnection is built-in defensive response that activates whenever vulnerable feelings emerge. The avoidant does not deliberately deny needs. Denial is a habitual pattern so deeply ingrained it feels like genuine lack of needs, rather than feeling like defensive suppression of needs that actually exist beneath defended awareness. This defensive suppression creates specific internal void where emotional experience should exist. The avoidant lives primarily in cognitive realm, thinking, analyzing, problem-solving, managing external reality through rational processes. The emotional realm remains largely inaccessible. Feelings are suppressed before they can be experienced. Emotional responses are minimized or intellectualized. The rich, complex feeling life that characterizes human emotional experience remains unknown or underdeveloped. The avoidant may experience limited range of emotions, perhaps anger that feels safer than vulnerable feelings, perhaps anxiety that breaks through defenses during crisis, perhaps fleeting positive emotions during defended comfortable moments. Yet, the full spectrum of human emotional experience, the vulnerable feelings of sadness and longing, the tender emotions of love and connection, the complex mixed feelings that characterize intimate relationships, remains largely outside their conscious experience due to defensive suppression. The super empath enters avoidance life, offering external access to the emotional world. The avoidance defenses prevent them accessing internally. The empath possesses profound emotional intelligence that allows them to understand and articulate feelings the avoidant cannot access in themselves. The empath demonstrates emotional expressiveness that gives the avoidant vicarious experience of feelings their defenses suppress. The empath offers emotional understanding that helps the avoidant make sense of their own defended internal experience in ways they cannot make sense of alone. The empath provides emotional vocabulary and framework that allows the avoidant to think about feelings even when they cannot directly feel those feelings themselves. The vicarious emotional access operates through several specific mechanisms that make super empath uniquely valuable to avoidant. The empath reads and names the avoidant's emotional states even when avoidant cannot identify their own feelings. Empath notices when avoidant is anxious, sad, overwhelmed, hurt even when avoidant experiences only physical sensations or vague discomfort without emotional awareness. This naming provides avoidant with understanding of their internal experience they cannot generate independently. The empath expresses feelings on behalf of the relationship that avoidant cannot express themselves. Empath communicates care, longing, desire for connection, hurt about distance that exists between them. This expression allows avoidant to experience those feelings externally through empath's expression, even while their defenses prevent them experiencing feelings internally in themselves. The empath also provides emotional depth and richness that makes the avoidant's otherwise defended sterile life feel more alive and meaningful. Relationships with less emotionally attuned people feel empty or boring to avoidant, even though logically, such relationships should feel comfortable, given avoidant's preference for emotional simplicity. The emptiness stems from lack of emotional depth. Without empath's emotional presence, avoidance life lacks the feeling dimension that creates meaning and vitality, even for defended people who suppress their own feelings. The super empath brings emotional aliveness into avoidance experience, makes life feel richer and more textured, provides sense of being truly known in ways defended surface interactions with less empathic people cannot provide. The avoidant may not consciously recognize they value this emotional depth, may even complain about empath's emotional intensity. Yet when empath is absent, avoidant experiences profound lack that reveals how much they depend on empath's emotional presence to make life feel meaningful. The super empath particularly provides access to the avoidant's own disowned vulnerability through the empath's willingness to be vulnerable. The avoidant has defended against their own vulnerability so thoroughly that vulnerable feelings feel foreign or threatening when they emerge. Yet the empath's comfort with vulnerability, the empath's ability to express vulnerable feelings without shame or defensiveness, allows the avoidant to experience vulnerability as safe human experience rather than as dangerous exposure requiring defense. Through witnessing empath's vulnerability, through experiencing that empath's vulnerability does not result in catastrophe or rejection, the avoidant gains indirect access to possibility that their own defended against vulnerability might be acceptable or even valuable rather than being dangerous weakness requiring constant suppression. The empath also functions as external emotional regulation system for the avoidant who has limited internal capacity for emotional regulation. The avoidant manages emotions primarily through suppression rather than through processing and regulation. When emotions threaten to emerge, defensive response is to shut down emotional experience rather than to feel emotion and regulate it toward resolution. The super empath provides alternative regulatory function by helping the avoidant tolerate emotional experiences the avoidant cannot regulate alone. When avoidant experiences anxiety, empath's calm presence regulates that anxiety externally. When avoidant experiences overwhelm, empath's grounding support provides regulation. The avoidant cannot generate internally. When avoidant experiences the relational stress their patterns create, empath's patient understanding allows avoidant to remain in relationship rather than fleeing emotional discomfort they cannot regulate without empath's help. Understanding that super empath provides what avoidance defenses prevent them accessing internally allows recognition of why avoidant cannot stay away, despite conscious preference for less emotional connection. The empath fills void in avoidance experience that avoidant may not consciously recognize as void because defenses have normalized the suppression. Yet unconsciously, the avoidant recognizes they need what empath provides, need the emotional access, need the understanding of their own defended experience, need the depth that makes life meaningful, need the vulnerability that connects them to disowned parts of themselves, need the external regulation that allows them to tolerate feelings their defenses cannot manage alone. This unconscious need creates magnetic pull that operates beyond avoidance conscious control, draws them to super empaths repeatedly despite conscious belief they want simpler, less emotionally intense connections, makes them unable to stay away from empaths even when their defenses create patterns that make sustainable relationship with empath impossible. Without therapeutic work, avoidant typically refuses to engage. The magnetic pull exists because the super empath mirrors the avoidant's disowned emotional self. The avoidant's defensive development required them to disown significant aspects of their authentic emotional self, to reject parts of themselves that felt too vulnerable, too needy, too emotional to be acceptable in their childhood environment. The child who becomes avoidant learned that expressing sadness led to dismissal or punishment, that seeking comfort resulted in rejection or unavailability, that showing fear generated contempt or abandonment. These experiences taught the child that certain aspects of human emotional experience were unacceptable, were dangerous to express, were parts of themselves that must be eliminated or hidden to maintain whatever limited connection or safety was available. The child responded by splitting off these unacceptable emotional parts, by disowning the vulnerable, needy emotional self that childhood environment could not tolerate. This disowning creates psychological splitting, where aspects of authentic self get rejected and suppressed, while other aspects get overdeveloped and emphasized. The emotional vulnerable parts get pushed into psychological shadow. They continue to exist as part of the person's complete self, yet they remain outside conscious awareness and outside acceptable self-concept. The cognitive controlled independent parts get overdeveloped as compensatory structure. These become the conscious acceptable self that the avoidant identifies with and presents to world. The splitting is not conscious choice, but is automatic defensive process. that allows child to survive environment that cannot tolerate their complete authentic self by disowning parts that are unacceptable and overemphasizing parts that are tolerated. Child creates adapted self that can function in limited environment, even though adapted self represents only partial expression of who they actually are. The super empath enters avoidance life embodying and expressing exactly the disowned emotional parts the avoidant rejected in themselves. The empath is comfortable with vulnerability that avoidant suppresses. The empath expresses needs for connection that avoidant denies. The empath demonstrates emotional depth that avoidant has defended against. The empath shows feeling capacity that avoidant has disconnected from. The empath lives from emotional authentic self that avoidant has split off and hidden in shadow. Essentially, the super empath is walking representation of everything the avoidant has disowned in themselves. Empath lives openly and comfortably with the exact qualities avoidant learned were unacceptable and had to eliminate from their conscious self-concept. This mirroring creates powerful magnetic attraction based on psychological principle that what we disown in ourselves we are compelled to seek in others. The disowned parts do not disappear through being rejected. They remain as active aspects of complete self-seeking integration and expression. Unable to access disowned parts internally due to defensive splitting, the psyche seeks those parts externally through attraction to people who embody what has been disowned. The avoidant is magnetically drawn to super empath because empath represents their own disowned emotional self, the vulnerable, feeling connected self they had to reject to survive childhood, but that remains as part of their complete psychological makeup seeking recognition and integration. The attraction operates unconsciously because recognizing that empath represents their own disowned self would threaten defensive structure that depends on believing disowned parts are not part of who they are. Consciously, avoidant may explain attraction to empath through other factors. Empath is attractive, interesting, intelligent, fun to be with. Consciously, avoidant may even criticize empath's emotional nature while remaining attracted, may complain empath is too emotional, too sensitive, too needy, while being unable to stay away from empath. These conscious explanations and criticisms serve defensive function of preventing recognition that attraction stems from empath embodying the avoidant's own rejected emotional self. Recognizing this would require facing that the emotional vulnerable parts they have spent lifetime suppressing are actually parts of themselves rather than being foreign threatening qualities that exist only in others. The mirroring also explains specific intensity of avoidance attraction to super empaths compared to less emotionally developed people. Partners who are less emotionally attuned do not mirror disowned self as completely or accurately. Partners who have some emotional capacity but limited empathic depth partially mirror disowned self, but not fully. The super empath specifically mirrors the complete range and depth of emotional capacity the avoidant has disowned, mirrors not just surface emotional expression, but profound emotional intelligence, deep feeling capacity, extensive empathic understanding. This complete mirroring creates strongest magnetic pull, because it most fully represents the disowned self-seeking recognition and integration. The attraction also intensifies because super empath not only embodies disowned emotional self, but demonstrates that emotional self can survive and even thrive. The avoidant disowned emotional parts because childhood taught those parts were unacceptable and dangerous. Expressing them led to rejection or harm. The super empath proves those early lessons were environment specific rather than universal truth. Empath's emotional vulnerability does not result in constant rejection. Empath forms meaningful connections through vulnerability rather than being rejected for it. Empath's emotional needs do not result in abandonment. Empath gets needs met through expressing them rather than being abandoned for having needs. Empath's emotional depth does not result in being overwhelmed or destroyed. Empath manages rich emotional life successfully rather than being destroyed by feelings. Witnessing empath's successful living from emotional self-challenges, avoidance defended belief that disowned parts must remain disowned for safety, suggests possibility that integration of disowned parts might be safe or even beneficial rather than dangerous. The mirroring dynamic particularly manifests through avoidance simultaneous attraction and repulsion toward empath's emotional nature. The attraction stems from recognition, however unconscious, that empath represents parts of themselves. The repulsion stems from defended fear of those same parts. The avoidant is drawn to empath's vulnerability because vulnerability represents their own disowned, vulnerable self-seeking expression. Yet avoidant is also threatened by empath's vulnerability because if vulnerability is acceptable, then defenses against their own vulnerability might be unnecessary, threatening entire defensive structure that has organized their psychology since childhood. This creates push-pull, where avoidant moves toward empath seeking what empath represents, then withdraws when closeness to empath threatens to activate their own disowned emotional parts that defenses must keep suppressed. Understanding that magnetic pull exists because super empath mirrors disowned emotional self allows recognition of why attraction feels compulsive rather than chosen. The avoidant cannot stay away from super empath because empath represents parts of themselves they unconsciously need to integrate for wholeness, parts that continue seeking expression and recognition despite defensive rejection. The attraction is not really about empath as separate person. Attraction is about avoidance' unconscious drive toward wholeness and integration, drawing them to person who embodies what they have split off from themselves. Yet this understanding also reveals why attraction alone cannot create sustainable relationship. The same defensive structure that required disowning emotional self also prevents integration of that disowned self without therapeutic work. The avoidant is drawn to empath representing disowned parts, yet cannot integrate what empath represents without addressing defenses that require disowning those parts originally. The result is magnetic attraction that creates unsustainable dynamic. Avoidant cannot stay away, yet cannot sustain intimacy, cannot leave yet cannot fully engage, remains trapped in push-pull between unconscious need for integration that draws them toward empath and defensive fear of integration that forces withdrawal when closeness threatens defensive structure. The attraction is real, but the dynamic is unsustainable without the avoidance therapeutic work. The magnetic attraction between avoidant and super empath is genuine powerful force rooted in deep psychological needs and in fundamental human drive toward wholeness and integration. The attraction is not manipulation, not performance, not strategy. It reflects avoidance' authentic unconscious need for what empath provides and for what empath represents. The avoidant truly cannot stay away from super empath because staying away means remaining disconnected from emotional world they need access to, means living in defended partial self without access to disowned emotional parts seeking integration, means enduring emotional void their suppression creates without the external filling that empath's presence provides. The pull feels compulsive because it is compulsive. Driven by fundamental psychological needs, the avoidant cannot meet independently due to defensive structure. Driven by unconscious process-seeking wholeness, the avoidant cannot achieve without accessing disowned parts empath represents. Yet the genuine, powerful attraction does not translate into capacity for sustainable, healthy relationship because attraction exists alongside unchanged defensive structure that prevents the avoidant from sustaining intimacy with empath. The same defenses that create avoidance need for what empath provides simultaneously prevent avoidant from maintaining relationship that would give sustained access to what empath offers. The defenses that suppressed emotional self create need for empath's emotional access. Yet those same defenses prevent tolerating intimacy required to receive empath's emotional offerings. The defenses that disowned vulnerable parts create attraction to empath who embodies disowned self. Yet those same defenses prevent integration that would resolve attraction by allowing avoidant to reclaim disowned parts, rather than seeking them externally in empath. The unsustainable dynamic manifests through predictable pattern where attraction draws avoidant toward empath, intimacy that develops triggers defenses, defenses force withdrawal that creates distance, distance creates renewed attraction as void returns, cycle repeats indefinitely without resolution. The avoidant pursues empath drawn by magnetic need for what empath provides. Initial connection feels amazing to avoidant. They experience emotional aliveness. They feel understood in unprecedented ways. They access feeling world through empath's presence. They experience glimpse of wholeness through proximity to person embodying their disowned parts. Yet as relationship deepens, as empath's emotional presence becomes more constant and intimate, as empath begins expecting reciprocal emotional engagement, the avoidance defenses activate. The intimacy exceeds defended tolerance. The emotional intensity threatens to activate avoidance' own suppressed feelings. The empath's needs for connection trigger avoidance' denied needs, creating defensive anxiety. The avoidant must withdraw to restore defended distance, must create space to re-establish suppression that intimacy with empath threatened to dissolve. The withdrawal creates renewed experience of void as empath's emotional presence is removed. The avoidant initially feels relief, defended comfort is restored, emotional intensity is eliminated, suppression can function without constant threat that empath's presence created. Yet relief gives way to void as avoidant experiences life without empath's emotional richness, without understanding empath provided, without access to feeling world empath allowed, without mirroring of disowned self-empath represented. The void recreates attraction and cycle begins again. Avoidant cannot stay away because void is intolerable, yet cannot sustain presence because intimacy is intolerable, remains trapped in push-pull that harms empath while failing to provide avoidant with stable access to what they need. The unsustainable dynamic particularly harms super empath, who experiences the push-pull as confusing and devastating. The empath experiences avoidance genuine attraction and interprets it as indication avoidant wants intimate relationship. The empath provides emotional understanding, vulnerable presence, patient support, believing these offerings will help avoidant feel safe enough to lower defenses and engage intimately. Yet the very offerings that initially attracted avoidant eventually trigger withdrawal because defenses cannot tolerate sustained intimacy, regardless of how safe empath makes that intimacy feel. The empath experiences withdrawal as rejection or as their failure to provide enough safety, leads to empath trying harder to be understanding and patient, which creates more intimacy that triggers more withdrawal, creating escalating cycle where empath depletes themselves trying to make intimacy safe enough that avoidance defenses will not activate. Attempt that cannot succeed because defenses activate in response to intimacy itself rather than in response to inadequate safety. The dynamic is unsustainable without avoidance therapeutic work because only therapeutic work can address the defensive structure creating the push-pull pattern. The attraction itself cannot resolve the dynamic. Being drawn to empath does not develop avoidance capacity to sustain intimacy. The empath's understanding and patience cannot resolve dynamic. However safe empath makes intimacy feel, defenses will activate when intimacy exceeds tolerance because defenses respond to intimacy itself rather than to specific threatening behaviors from empath. Time does not resolve dynamic. Years in relationship may create familiarity, but familiarity does not restructure defenses that have existed since childhood. Only genuine therapeutic work addressing defensive structure can create capacity for sustainable relationship with super empath the avoidant is drawn to. The therapeutic work required includes trauma-informed therapy that addresses attachment wounds, creating defensive structure, that helps avoidant understand how childhood experiences taught them to suppress emotions and disconnect from needs, that supports gradual safe reconnection with disowned emotional parts, rather than continuing to seek those parts exclusively externally in empath. The work includes developing internal emotional awareness and regulation capacity, rather than depending on empath for all emotional access and regulation. The work includes practicing vulnerability in therapeutic relationship, where safety can be gradually established, allowing avoidant to learn that vulnerability does not result in catastrophe. Childhood experiences taught them to expect. The work includes examining defenses themselves, understanding when they activate, what triggers them, what function they serve, so defenses can become conscious choice rather than automatic unconscious response. Without this therapeutic work, the magnetic attraction creates trap for both avoidant and empath. The avoidant remains trapped, seeking externally what they need to develop internally, drawn to empaths for access to emotional world, yet unable to sustain relationships that would provide that access, cycling through relationships, leaving trail of harmed empaths, while never developing capacity to integrate what attracts them to empaths. The empath remains trapped, believing their understanding and patience will eventually help avoidant feel safe enough to engage fully, depleting themselves trying to make intimacy tolerable to defenses that cannot tolerate sustained intimacy, regardless of empath's efforts, sacrificing their own needs and well-being for relationship with person whose attraction is real, but whose capacity remains insufficient for sustainable partnership.